Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. This was a second good week in a row for the Coalition, with the opposition taking the lead on a two-party preferred basis for the first time since late September. The Coalition, now on 51%, up 1.5%, has a narrow lead over the ALP on 49% on a two-party preferred basis. So if a federal election were held now, the result would be too close to call. Either party, the Coalition or ALP, would require the support of minor parties and independents to form government, according to the latest Roy Morgan survey. Now, the big news last week surrounded Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's allegedly asking for flight upgrades from Qantas and former CEO Alan Joyce. Albanese denied contacting anyone at Qantas, including Joyce, to ask for any upgrades. Nevertheless, this is politics, and the scandal detracted from a potentially good news story for the government when the official ABS quarterly inflation dropped 1% to 2.8% for the September quarter, the lowest figure for over 3 years. However, despite that drop, the Reserve Bank decided to leave interest rates unchanged yesterday, given that core inflation, or the trimmed mean, remains above the 2 to 3% target range at 3.4%. There was little change in the other key weekly indicators. Government confidence, that's whether people think the country's going in the right or wrong direction, was little changed at 77.5 and well below the neutral level of 100. This is because fewer Australians said the country's going in the right direction. 31.5% say it's going in the right direction. A majority of 54% still say the country's going in the wrong direction. Coming back to voting intention, the swing to the Coalition this week came from the changing preferences of supporters of independents and minor parties. In fact, the primary vote, or support increased in primary vote, for both major parties. Coalition support was up 0.5% to 38%, and ALP support was also up 0.5% to 30.5%. Support for the Greens was unchanged at 14%, One Nation support increased 0.5% to 6%, and support for other parties was unchanged at 4%, but support for independents dropped 1.5% to 7.5%. Now, with more than 30% of electors giving their first preference to a non-major party, it's clear preferences are critically important. And Roy Morgan preference data shows that the preference flows are very different today than they were at the last election. Preference flows are more strongly favouring the Coalition today. In fact, if preferences from this week's Roy Morgan survey are allocated based on how Australians gave their preferences at the 2022 federal election, the two-party preferred result would be reversed and would in fact favour the ALP on 51% to LNP on 49%. But the Roy Morgan survey allocates preferences based on how people say they'll vote, as we believe it's important to measure the pulse of the nation at this point in time, not looking back at history. Consumer confidence, ANZ Roy Morgan consumer confidence was unchanged this week at 86.5. Importantly, as we enter the most critical retailing period of the year, the pre-Christmas and Black Friday period, consumer confidence has now spent 3 weeks above 85 for the first time since January 2023. ANZ Roy Morgan inflation expectations were unchanged this week, with Australians still expecting annual inflation to be 4.6% over the next 2 years. Now to New Zealand. In New Zealand, both key indicators, government confidence and consumer confidence, decreased in October, following several key pieces of bad news. Roy Morgan government confidence dropped 6.5 points to 86 in October. And the ANZ Roy Morgan New Zealand consumer confidence, the measure of consumers' economic sentiment, decreased 3.9 points to 91.2. So what was the bad news preceding these declines? Well, essentially, figures from Stats New Zealand in late September showed GDP contracting in the June quarter by 0.2%, the first quarterly decline since the September quarter 2023. And annual growth in New Zealand GDP was also negative for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic, shrinking by 0.2% compared to a year ago. This poor economic news, as well as other challenges on several fronts, led to a sharp decline in support for the National-led government. The Roy Morgan poll in New Zealand shows a significant swing away from the party in power. Support for National plunged 6.5% to 31%. That's the lowest since last year's New Zealand election. While support for the main opposition, Labor, increased 6% to 29%, leaving a gap of only 2% between the two major parties. Importantly, 40% of electors now support one of the minor parties, including the Greens, ACT, New Zealand First and the Maori Party. This compares to 35% at last year's election. We're seeing again a growth in people supporting non-major parties. Overall, for the first time since last year's election, the parliamentary opposition has taken a narrow lead over Luxon's National-led government. Now, 48%, up 7%, support the parliamentary opposition, including 29% for Labor, 14% for the Greens and 5% for the Maori Party. Support for the National-led government has dropped 8% to 47%. This includes 31% support for National, 9% for ACT and 7% for New Zealand First. And that's a wrap. Thanks for your interest this week in Roy Morgan's latest results. And I'll be back next week to bring you the most up-to-date readings on consumer confidence, inflation expectations, unemployment and voting intention in Australia. Obviously, a key factor to look for in next week's figures is what impact the result of the US presidential election might have on the key weekly indicators, and whether we see a positive or negative reaction in Australia. This is something we'll be keeping a close eye on. Thanks for listening.